And I'm going to call this section Connecting the Dots on the True State of the Economy, Telling the Truth About the Lies. I go around the country speaking before groups. I've been in 6 states in the past 6 months. I survey quite a bit, and I ask people, like I'm asking you right now. We're told every single day on mainstream news, the lamestream drive-by media, we're told all the time we're in a recovery. They preface everything with the economic recovery is moving a little slower than anticipated, or the economic recovery in this sector is very strong and promising. They preface everything with a recovery. Do you believe we're in a true, stable economic recovery? No, you don't. Of course you don't. I survey people. I say, do we believe mainstream media is reporting non-biased information and facts so we can be well informed on the evening news? No, we're not. I ask people around this country, and the surveys overwhelmingly show that we no longer trust mainstream media, and we also do not believe that the majority of the political and elected leaders that we placed in Washington are getting the job done that we sent them there to do. And as I continue to survey, I ask people, do you feel that Wall Street and corporate America and financial advisors and brokers have your best interest in mind? And they laugh, of course. These have become rhetorical questions. I would have looked like a lunatic asking these questions 5 years ago. It's a major paradigm shift taking place. Everything was held together by confidence. In fact, money can be defined as an idea backed by confidence, a means to exchange with something that represents value. Well, there is no value. There's no gold and silver backing our currency. Every paper currency in the world is a fiat currency, not backed by tangible assets, printed without discretion by crazy governments. This is where we find ourselves today. We are caught between the proverbial rock and a hard place. Now, the Federal Reserve, since the inception of the Fed just about 100 years ago, has managed and Congress and their policies have managed to devalue our currency and lose its purchasing power by about 98%. This is going to lead to a very, very big problem. So you can't have an economic recovery with these types of things going on. What I'd like to talk about now in Section 2 is the crisis, connecting the dots on the true state of the economy and telling the truth about the lies. Now, before I do, I was at a meeting not too long ago. There was a meeting that took place in this boardroom, and Ron Paul was asked to sign an autograph currency, a bill from someone. So he took the money and he said, sure, I'll autograph it. And he signed it and he handed it back to the guy and he said, here you go. Now it's worth something. And I think that states the case on the devaluing of the dollar. So let's talk about the true state of the economy, what we're not getting on the evening news. You can't have a recovery when, of course, recently the S&P downgraded the creditworthiness of the United States. We went from our pristine AAA status to AA minus or AA plus. But that's not the alarming, although that's pretty newsworthy. The real issue also is the Weiss agency, WEISS. We are now at a C minus rating. You see, there's 5 different agencies that rate, but out of 5, there's only one that's not paid by these governments and by financial institutions to rate, and that is the Weiss agency. And the Weiss agency has downgraded us to C minus, which is one level from junk status, one level away from junk status. Recently, the agency Fitch, they didn't downgrade the rating as of this recording. They did, though, downgrade our outlook from positive to negative, which is the first step that they take when they begin the downgrading. So you can't have an economic recovery with these downgrades taking place. China downgraded us, not once but twice in 2011. They have their rating agencies. Now, you may be saying, well, who cares what China does? Think twice. We owe China about $2 trillion, and it is a globally connected economy now. So China has downgraded us twice. And, of course, the G7, G8, and G20 meetings for the better part of the last 2 years, as recently as last quarter of 2011, they meet. And one of the main subjects on the itinerary is, of course, how to decouple, how to move away from the U.S. dollar as a world's reserve currency. In fact, China and Russia renounced the U.S. dollar in 2011. They no longer use the U.S. dollar for bilateral trade amongst each other's nations. This is a big news story, folks. What does it mean to be the world's reserve currency status? It's important to understand that, and so we'll go into history for a moment. Back in 1944, and I'm summarizing and paraphrasing and keeping it simple, the leading nations of the world met during the war in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and it's known as the Bretton Woods Agreement. And it's there they met and basically said, we will use U.S. dollars to facilitate trade amongst nations to make it easier for us to trade, and we'll build a more global stability. And so that meant oil and international settlements and trades amongst these nations would have to be done in U.S. dollars. Aha! Supply and demand. That made the dollar strong. The central banks around the world were required to have what? U.S. dollars in their banks. And that's where the trades were done. And it's been that way to this day. That is changing, and as a major paradigm shift. So the global community is moving away from the U.S. dollar. In fact, George Soros funded in 2011, I think it was April, a summit they held. Something titled like the New World Financial Summit. And of course, one of the subjects on there is how to move away from the U.S. dollar as a world's reserve currency. Now, interestingly to note here, where did they hold the meeting? They held the meeting in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. So that's where the dollar got its strength over these decades and became the world's reserve currency. And it's at that meeting where that dollar's trying to be overthrown as the world's reserve currency. And make no mistake about it, folks. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And I'll forecast right now, we're going to see continuous downgrades from the agencies here in the United States. And then we're going to lose our world's reserve status. And the day that happens, we will collapse relatively overnight, as central banks around the world have no need for these U.S. dollars. So, we're connecting the dots on the true state of the economy and telling the truth about the lies. Can't have an economic recovery with $15 trillion of federal debt. Over $15 trillion. Now, it's mathematically impossible, the economists will tell you, to pay this off. So we have to think, what's the end game? Now, we're talking about debt here for a moment. Let's say the United States were a publicly traded company. It is a corporation, but we'll save that for a different talk. Let's say the United States was a publicly traded company, and you're looking to invest in this. And you look at their balance sheet and you say, they got a lot of debt, $15 trillion. But someone keeps telling you, oh, they've been good, the world's reserve, great company for decades. You need to invest in this company. So you look and you say, well, they have a lot of debt. What did they do recently to solve this? They must have a solution that they've been good for 100 years. They recently raised the debt ceiling to borrow another over $2 trillion. Well, that's not so good. Well, they must clearly have a way to produce their goods and services to work their way out of this massive debt. They've exported the majority blue-collar and white-collar jobs to other nations over the last 30 years and still do so to this date. You get the idea. You wouldn't invest in this company, this country called the United States of America. And neither is the international community. They're looking to get away from the U.S. dollar. So, folks, our window of opportunity is narrowing. Now, stay with me here. This is Section 2, the crisis, connecting the dots on the true state of the economy. We will cover in Section 3 solutions for the escalating crisis, but we must recognize how critical this is because the mainstream media is not reporting this. Now, we have about $1.7 trillion of short-term treasuries getting ready in March of 2012 to mature. And chances are, since foreign countries are dumping the dollar, that they probably will not be reinvesting in March. Okay, let's talk about inflation. An economist will tell you the definition of inflation is not rising prices. If you ask the common man on the street, like me, the common guy, if you said, hey, John, what does inflation mean to you? I would say, well, it means gas is $10 a gallon. My electric bill has doubled. But an economist will tell you rising prices is nothing more than a symptom of inflation. Inflation, the purest sense of the definition of inflation, is nothing more than an increase in the money supply. When you flood the marketplace with too much of something, it becomes worth less, particularly when it's a currency not chasing enough goods and services. So, let's look at what's happened in recent years. In 2008, they increased the money supply by approximately 13%. And the economists will tell you, and it's not an exact science, but it will take about 2 or 3 years for that increase of money supply to manifest as inflation, price inflation on Main Street, where we start to feel it in our pocketbook. And it will parallel the increase, the percentage increase that they did. So to recap that, in 2008, they increased the money supply by 13%. Well, that's why beginning of 2012, here we are at 2011, the end of 2011, and we see inflation, the real rate of inflation, at about 10 to 13%, depending which economists you look at. It takes about 3 years for it to manifest. Now, of course, the government's reporting a different inflation number. Ben Bernanke and Tim Geithner will tell you inflation is under control at about 2 or 3%. No one believes this, of course. They don't count food and energy when they calculate the CPI and the inflation rate. They take food and energy and other things out, and then they report inflation. Last time I checked, most people eat food and use energy. So when you put food and energy back, your inflation rate is somewhere between 10 and 13%, but you know that. Apparently, Ben Bernanke's not shopping at the same supermarket you're shopping at. And so, we're talking about inflation, folks. Now, here's the bad news. In 2009, they increased the money supply by over 120%. That's an oh wow moment, isn't it? Because we just learned it takes about 3 years for that percentage increase to manifest as a percentage of price inflation. That takes us into 2012, where we find ourselves today. We're going to be looking at significant double-digit inflation and soon triple-digit inflation. This is hyperinflation, folks. This is where we're going to find ourselves very, very soon. We're going to be entering into an inflationary period that's going to make the Jimmy Carter days look like a picnic in the park. Our window of opportunity is narrowing. I met this year with Congressman Ron Paul, Judge Andrew Napolitano, former presidential candidate Tom Tancredo, talked with Dr. Paul Prentice, economist who worked under Ronald Reagan, talked with Dr. Kirk Elliott frequently. When you listen to Mark Faber and Max Kaiser and Gerald Celente, the world's #1 trends forecaster, John Williams, any economist worth their salt. I'm talking about progressive left Keynesians, talking about your Austrian-based economists. They're all going to tell you, including the National Inflation Association, that the collapse of the dollar and hyperinflation can arrive as early as tomorrow morning to about 2+ years. That's it. And I believe this may be coming closer towards the end of 2012. So, we have to prepare. We're going to talk about solutions in the next section. But you can have an economic recovery. The greatest nation on earth is broke. We're the world's largest debtor nation. And they're printing money like there's no tomorrow at Weimar Republic rates. And so you can't have an economic recovery when the great state of Utah passed in their House legislature in 2011 to use both gold and silver as legal tender in the state of Utah. Bill O'Reilly apparently forgot to mention that on his talking points, and you won't hear that from CNBC or Anderson Cooper. But you're hearing it today. Maybe you knew that. There's about a dozen states that are taking this legislation, drafted and put into law by Utah, and looking at it for their own states. This tells you there's a problem. It tells you there's no confidence in the currency of the U.S. dollar. Then you have a bank in Georgia that takes gold and silver and deposit. Now, the state of Virginia wants their own currency. They don't even want to use the U.S. dollar. Now, the constitutional attorneys that we consult with in our foundation, Save America Foundation, they let us know that that has some significant constitutional challenges. But the point is, we're in trouble, folks. America is in trouble. Global governance is here. The New World Order has arrived front and center. Now, you can't have an economic recovery when, according to the Pew Center, they said 45 out of 57 states. Did I say 57 states? Oh, yes, I did. I was quoting someone who said 57 states in an interview a couple of years ago. Oh, that's right. It was President Obama. Now, incidentally, there are 57 Muslim states, and there are Freudian slips, but we'll save that for a different discussion. According to the Pew Center, 45 out of 50 states are in the red and on the verge of economic collapse and bankruptcy. You've got Florida, Nevada, Wisconsin, New Jersey, Michigan, California, Illinois, and the list goes on and on. Pennsylvania recently filed, I think it's Chapter 9. Now, an economist will tell you, if you want to do a bird's eye macro view on the health of an economy, of a nation, you want to look at two main statistics. You want to know how employment and real estate is doing. And that'll give you your basic gauge. Well, how are those two things working out in America today? Up or down? Down. Not very good. In fact, unemployment is at about 23%. Now, the government reports 9.1 or whatever the current statistic is they report. But again, like the CPI where they fudge the statistics, they do the same thing with employment. They don't count those that fell off the unemployment rolls. They don't count those that gave up looking for work and many other factors. And when you put all that back in the mix, unemployment today sits at about 23%. And during the height of the Great Depression in America, unemployment was 24.7. We're less than 2 percentage points away from where we were then. And Wall Street and CNBC, they cheer when they report new unemployment numbers. They say, well, this week it's good news, only 375,000 people filed for unemployment instead of the anticipated 410,000. And that's good news? Hey, it's a recession when your neighbor loses his job. It's a depression, of course, when you lose yours. And some people say it's a recovery when Barack Hussein Obama and most of the folks up in Congress and the House are sent back to the street. Then we can have a recovery. But listen, folks, unemployment is a big, big problem in this country, and it's not getting better anytime soon. The other gauge is real estate. How's real estate working out? Not so good. In fact, experts say real estate may come down another 15 to 30% in the next year or so before it hits bottom. It's not rocket science. You have more and more people unemployed, more and more people throwing money in the empty black hole with their houses upside down, and it's putting more and more foreclosures on the market. That drives prices down. And as inflation goes up, the cost to build new homes goes up. And so we have a big problem in real estate still here. Now, let's talk about the stock and bond market. Stock market is not strong for technical or fundamental reasons. Hey, even if the Dow goes to 14 or 15,000, it is not strong for technical and fundamental reasons. Most of your technical analysts are going to tell you that the Dow, if you want to use as a gauge, the price to earnings are out of whack by probably 35% or more. Meaning these lofty stock prices are not supported by earnings. These prices are not supported by their earnings. You don't have companies, generally speaking in America, hiring. They're laying people off. The few companies that have cash, are they investing it? No, they're holding it because of the uncertainties of tax policy and the currencies and the administration and the election. Are companies producing goods and services with great rising statistics and exports that the world are buying in mass for profit? No, not at all. So the stock market, as an asset class, stocks are not strong for technical or fundamental reasons and are going to come down like the World Trade Center. They're going to come down like dominoes at some point. You shouldn't be in the stock market if you're looking to preserve wealth because it's a managed economy. Yes, you can make money trading, short-term trading, no doubt about it. get some expert software or some expert short-term traders and you'll make some money. But if you're looking to preserve wealth, the stock market is not the place to be. I hate to say it, but just go look up the word fascism. Forget about socialism and communism. Those are precursors and predecessors to where they end up. When you look up the word fascism in the dictionary, you're going to see big government and big business kind of becoming one, controlling distributions of goods and services. Do you see that happening? It's part of global governance, folks. So you have a managed economy. So stock market's not strong. Second is bond market. Your financial advisor today will say, we'll take the volatility out of the stock portfolio, Mrs. Jones, by adding a nice blend of bonds. That's the fire into the frying pan. Bond market's in market cap bigger than the stock market. Bond market's got more risk than the stock market does right now. In fact, the Congressional Budget Office back in 2011, the Congressional Budget Office issued an advisory to over 150 municipalities and cities to default on their municipal bonds. And they are. We're at the end of a 28-year low interest rate cycle. When this election's over in 2012, you're going to see interest rates shoot through the ceiling. And when interest rates rise, bonds drop. And so we're going to have a big, big meltdown in the bond market, folks. And bonds are defaulting. You need to find out the true value of your bond if you liquidated it today. And don't wait if you have a loss in that liquidation price, because it's going to become illiquid later on. So the bond market's not strong. The stock market is not strong. In fact, you've got the majority of your health, life, and annuity companies by National Association of Insurance Commissioner mandate. They're required to invest in their general account up almost 90% into bonds. 80 to 90%. Most have close to 90%. So you're going to see a big problem in the insurance market. Health, life, and annuity companies are already being downgraded. Remember, there's 5 rating agencies. We covered them before: S&P, Fitch, Moody's, Weiss, and I think it's AM Best. But only 1 out of the 5 is not paid to rate. That's the rating you want. So go to the Weiss rating. Take a look at your insurer through Weiss. You'll get the truer rating, in my opinion. And so you're going to find not all, but most of your A-rated carriers are no longer A-rated. And these products are a false sense of security, in my opinion. Again, these health, life, and annuity carriers have to have close to 90% in bonds, and we're going to be in a rising interest rate environment, perhaps for the next 15 or 20 years. Those bonds are going to drop. So you're left with an annuity where you can only access 10% per year, generally speaking, of your money. 90% you can't get at. In a crisis, you want to be liquid. So it's a false sense of security being in these annuity contracts. In my view. I know I'm all sunshine and lollipops today, aren't I? Lots of good news here. But listen, to be forewarned is to be forearmed. And again, don't shoot me. I'm only the messenger. I've cited most of my sources. Do your own homework. Do your due diligence. Also encourage you to visit a few websites. Visit SaveAmericaFoundation.com, AssetPreservationInstitute.org. And for those that like the technical analysis, visit John Williams' site, shadowstats.com. Shadowstats.com. I consider him to be the economist's economist. I'm going to close this section out with a very, very important quote from him that you'll want to listen to. But let's go back to connecting the dots on the true state of the economy, telling the truth about the lies, because we're not in economic recovery. We're on the brink of a catastrophe of mammoth proportions. Make no mistake about it. Now, pensions. All state pensions will go belly up. Newsflash, all state pensions will go belly up between 2014 and 2044. This report's available on our sites. This is done by the PhD study at the Kellogg Business University. Now, that's based on an 8% annual return. They're not getting 8%. So 2014 to 2044, and clearly sooner because of the lack of performance in these portfolios, state pensions go belly up. When will your state pension go belly up? Now here's no newsflash here. Social Security is broke. but they backed it in. I think it's 5 years soon. I think it's 2025 is the year that the obligations can't be met. There's not enough money to meet the Social Security demand in 2025. But we don't need to worry about that because we're going to have a currency collapse long before then. All right, last piece of bad news here before we move into the next section, solutions for the escalating crisis, is the IRAs and 401ks. Qualified accounts, 403bs, IRAs, 401ks, Roth IRAs, all these types of accounts. There's a 1,100-page bill in committee. This is the IRA Confiscation Act. That's not what it's called, of course. That's what I call it. They have names for it. They call it the Government Retirement Annuity or the Guaranteed Retirement Account. You can Google GRAs. I think the new name they have for it is, they're calling it the Lifetime Income Option Program. But listen, Congress got together about 2 or 3 years ago, and they said, we can manage the people's money better than they can. We can do a better job at managing your assets than you. Now, I find that very interesting because they managed to take, over the years, our tax dollars and create $15 trillion worth of debt, while we managed to save $6 trillion in the IRA accounts and 401ks, etc. But they can do a better job managing our money than we, the sheeple. And so what they've done is they've drafted an 1,100-page bill. It's been through some public hearing phases, and last one that we know of was last quarter of 2010, actually, where the ERISA, the Labor Board, and Treasury Department met. Look, in essence, this is a complicated bill with all kinds of things in it, but basically it says we're going to do a forced allocation out of wherever your accounts are into U.S. Treasury-backed annuity. You can't make this stuff up. A U.S. Treasury, the very Treasury that's being downgraded, that the world is dumping, the U.S. dollar. So a U.S. Treasury-backed annuity, annuitizing it at 3% over your remaining life expectancy and paying you this guaranteed retirement account. Now, you can't go touch corpus or principal. You only get the guaranteed income. Annuitize at 3%. Where inflation sits at 13% at this talk anyway today. And so then when you die and go to heaven, they keep 50% of it. I mean, there's more formulas to it, but that's basically what it says. Now, I encourage you to go to assetpreservationinstitute.org, and on the flash screen homepage, you can click and get a copy of this. It is in the Federal Register on page 5,300 something. Do your homework. I'll talk about strategies later to rescue these accounts and maximize them. But again, folks, our window of opportunity is narrowing to do so. So in conclusion, on Section 2 of this talk here today, called The Crisis, and make no mistake, it is a crisis, I'm going to read to you a report I got emailed to me from John Williams, shadowstats.com, again, the economist's economist. He said this in March of 2011. He said, the coming great collapse draws near. The U.S. economic and systemic solvency crisis of the past 4 years only have been precursors to the coming great collapse, a hyperinflationary Great Depression. Such will encompass a complete collapse in the purchasing power of the U.S. dollar. A collapse in the normal stream of U.S. commercial and economic activity. A collapse in the U.S. financial system as we know it, and a likely realignment of the U.S. political environment. He says the outside timing for a full-blown hyperinflation remains 2014, less than 2 years from now. But he says there's a strong risk of the currency catastrophe beginning to unfold. Now, he says moving into a full-blown hyperinflation could take months to a year, depending on two things. The developing global view of the dollar. Well, what's the developing global view of the dollar? Good or bad for the dollar? Bad for the dollar, isn't it? They're moving away from the U.S. dollar. China divested 97% in 2011 out of its short-term U.S. Treasury holdings, from about $213 billion down to $5 billion. So John Williams says we can end up in a hyperinflation sooner or later, depending on the global view of the dollar. Well, the global view of the dollar is not good. Then he also says it depends upon the reactions of the U.S. government and the Federal Reserve. Well, my goodness. What are the reactions there? Good or bad for the dollar? Horrific for the dollar. Printing more money, monetizing debt, printing trillions of dollars to stave off collapses in Europe, raising the debt ceiling, and on and on. That's what the federal government and the Federal Reserve private for-profit bankers have done. And I failed to mention something extremely important. Again, you're not going to find this on the evening news. What did the Federal Reserve do in the last 2 months of 2011 that didn't get much press? Well, let's go back. We have to go back. And what they did is devastating to the currency and to this nation. It's monetary treason. Make no mistake about it. What they did was, let's go back to 2008, and we'll come full circle. You have to understand this first. In 2008, when the collapse came, when Hank Paulson, former Goldman Sachs, at the time Treasury Secretary under Bush, came running to the podium and said, the sky is falling, I need $1 trillion tomorrow or the world will come to an end. Remember that period of time when Lehman Brothers went out of business and Bear Stearns went out of business and all these corporations were collapsing. Well, what happened is Bank of America was collapsing too. But they're one of the 6 big banks that are going to stay. They're one of the too big to jail banks. You see, there's about 6 banks that will probably remain, and you know who they are: Citigroup, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs. And so Bank of America back in 2008 was about to go belly up. But they were bailed out. Billions of our tax dollars to keep B of A in business. What did they do with that investment shortly thereafter? They bought Countrywide, one of the largest, not one of the largest mortgage holder in America outside of Fannie and Freddie. They bought them with these tax dollars. What else did they do? This is important to come to what happened at the end of 2011. What else did Bank of America do with those funds at that time? They bought Merrill Lynch, who was also about to go out of business. Aha! Now we come full circle to what the Federal Reserve private bank did to the taxpayer in this country. What they did at the end of 2011, which didn't get much press, is Merrill Lynch had about $76 trillion of exposure in the derivatives markets in European banks. Well, as the European Union, as we see, is going by the wayside and the euro is going to be gone soon, we see this mess unfolding in Europe. What did they do, knowing this was going to hit Merrill, which would hit B of A, which would wreak havoc in America? They backstopped $76 trillion worth of these derivatives, which basically means they made digitally available U.S. dollars to, as these derivatives pop, cover it. That $76 trillion ends up on the balance sheet of the U.S. taxpayer. Now, derivatives are complicated investments. You have to do some more homework on how much of that value really ends up on our balance sheet, maybe a third. It's a lot of money. But it gets worse. The plot thickens. Because remember the movie When Harry Met Sally? And there's that famous diner scene where the lady says, I'll have what she's having. Well, that's exactly what J.P. Morgan Chase did. They said, I'll have what Bank of America's having because we have $79 trillion of derivatives exposure in European banks. Folks, this is the tip of the iceberg, MF Global, for example, because there's over an estimated $1.2 quadrillion in derivatives. So this derivative bubble is the next bubble to burst. We haven't had a real economy maybe in decades. They create them. You had the dot-com bubble, that burst. The real estate market, that burst. The credit bubble, that burst. Right now, we have the derivative bubble, and then the dollar bubble. And then that's it, endgame. See, global governance is here. The New World Order has arrived. So $1.2 quadrillion is the tip of the iceberg. The derivatives is the next major bubble bursting, and then, of course, the currency. We have to understand that hyperinflation is not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And any economist worth their salt would agree. The end value of any currency nearly 100% of the time throughout history in a hyperinflation is zero. It becomes worthless. And our time frame, as we talked about earlier, for this hyperinflation is tomorrow morning to perhaps a little over 2 years, if we can make it that long. So our window of opportunity is narrowing. Now back to John Williams from shadowstats.com, the economist's economist. He closes out with this, and I would concur, and that brings us into our solutions section. He says, with no viable or politically practical way of balancing the U.S. fiscal condition and avoiding this financial, economic Armageddon, he says the best that individuals can do at this point in the crisis is to protect themselves, both as to meeting short-range survival needs as well as to preserving current wealth and assets over the longer term.
We all need to take action now. For a free consultation on how to protect your assets, visit TrueState.tv. Click on the Death of a Nation link and fill out the web form just below this video.